Well, to talk to us a little further about this, we're now joined by Angelo Fick, who's the Director of Research at Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute. So, Angelo, great to talk to you. I hate to say this, but did we really expect anything else from the Auditor-General?
Absolutely not. Good evening, Peter, to you and to your viewers. I think what we heard from the Auditor-General was exactly what was needed in this time. And crucially, it is a call to action for the people who got voted into power in 2021's local government elections to wake up, because they're inheriting this and they must improve, because we are now not even teetering at the cliff's edge. We're over the edge of that cliff and we need to climb back up.
So I guess, as we do every year, we try and figure out what's going wrong. Cadre deployment has by and large been what's been pointed to. Does that continue?
Clearly, because as the Auditor-General pointed out, there are people who are paid to the tune of billions in total to do the kind of work that they then cannot do, and consequently go out and hire consultants who then also do a botch-up job. Because one of the concerns in this particular cycle of reporting was that despite the 10 billion spent on salaries and the additional more than 1 billion spent on consultants, the Auditor-General still found that her office had to point out errors, mistakes, misreporting by these consultants after the fact. And this means that there are 3 stages at which the work failed to be done by the people employed, by the oversight inside government, and then by the consultants appointed by the people in government. And it's only when the Auditor-General's people step in that you then have a correction of the errors. And that's really unacceptable, because that's completely wasteful expenditure. Why are the people who are being paid to do the job not doing it? Why are they hiring consultants who then prove to be unable to do the job? And why are they paying people who are then also proving to be incapable?
It seems to me that there's a systemic problem here as well, because it can't be that we wait once a year to find out what's wrong. I would have thought that there are interim audits that are done and periodic reviews that are done just to check that things are okay, so that you can take corrective behavior. You can't wait a whole year to get a temperature on something.
Well, precisely, and the report points this out. It's just on 80 pages, and it's interesting to compare those places in which the audit found positive changes and also positive developments and positive delivery, and the places in which those were not found. Control environment comes up again and again in the report, which is, it isn't just, it in fact isn't this Chapter 9 organization's job to do the audit, to do more than the audit. In other words, to correct people's errors. That's the job of all sorts of mechanisms inside municipal government, as well as in provincial government, to do the oversight, to make sure. So there are committees that are supposed to have been established to make sure that the funding and spending process happens appropriately. There are oversight committees to make sure that tenders are awarded appropriately. There are accounting officers, there are mayors and municipal managers who have to do the job. And of course, there's consequence for people not doing their job, and that's the second problem. So not only is there no control environment, but there's also no consequence management. So people don't do what they're expected to do, and nothing really happens to them. And that, I think, is part of the systemic issue that you point out in your question, and that the Auditor-General is pointing to.
Revenue collection is being raised as an issue, and I'm not sure how one solves this, because to collect money from debtors, which are consumers, which are people that are unemployed, living in dire conditions, etc., they don't have the money to pay, but the municipalities providing services, how can they solve this problem? On the one hand, they've got to pay for certain things, but they don't have the money coming in.
So there is that problem in a country with the economic woes that South Africa has undergone historically, but also more recently in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. But there is an additional problem which worsens that problem, which is that where people have been paying and where municipalities are collecting, the way in which they're choosing to spend their money means that either they first settle their salary bills and make sure that everybody who works in the municipality gets paid, then they settle the large debtors, so the energy supply Supply Commission. And then, they're not spending the loans that they're getting. They're not spending the money that they're getting from provincial and national government appropriately. There are grants that they apply for water and other forms of infrastructure, which they're not spending wisely or not at all. And so in places like Madibeng, for example, in the northwest, the problem has been going on for a decade, where they've had, poor water infrastructure, which then, requires intervention, but that isn't maintained. So that vandalism and criminality make sure that the process doesn't work. And so, the people in the community suffer. And this is where I think the Auditor-General's call for civic actors to step up to the plate, and that politics isn't just a once in a 5-year cycle where you vote, and that communities get even more involved in the oversight, in the councils, in the municipal legislatures, to make sure that things are dealt with, and that this goes up to provincial government, that provincial government takes care of its oversight structure, because after all, the Constitution requires of all 3 tiers of government to interact to ensure that citizens experience the full constitutional benefit of the Republic of South Africa. And that, I think, means that this isn't just a municipal governance failure. This is also a failure at the provincial level and the national level, because the breakdown towards the end of the report shows that in one province, for example, it has worked particularly well. The Western Cape, the municipalities are doing particularly well in terms of their audit, in terms of the layout, in terms of finance management. In several other provinces, the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Northwest Province, for example, Free State, often the paperwork isn't even appropriate, which means that the people who are being paid to do the job of keeping records and reporting and accounting in the municipality are not qualified to do so, or don't know their jobs, and that's a real concern.
The Auditor-General's powers have been enhanced for quite some time now, so that it isn't just a reporting function, and that their recommendations, much like the public protector, must be followed. What's going wrong? Because if they're not being followed, that means someone's breaking the law. Absolutely, and this is where the lawlessness that people see when infrastructure is vandalized is mirrored by the lawlessness of those who govern. Because after all, if recommendations are given and they're not implemented, it is the duty of the accounting officers in the municipality to make sure that they are. If they're not, it is the COGTA officer and officials in the provincial government and national government who have to follow up on this. And then it's also the duty of various prosecuting agencies to follow up on this. And this is where I think the relationship between various Chapter 9 organizations have to become better, because a lot of this is about public money misspent, and so the public protector's involvement should be more prominent than it is. These are human rights violations, so the Human Rights Commission's intervention should be more clear. And then, it becomes something when a province does not act on a municipality's not just poor performance, but lack of performance. And as you point out, violations of law. And then national government also has to begin to think of what has to happen in order to make sure. Because, again, this isn't about just putting aside the responsibility. These 3 tiers of government are constitutionally mandated, obligated to work together to ensure that South Africans have a better quality of life. And in the Western Cape, where we've seen provincial and municipal government interacting appropriately, we've seen positive results. We've seen similar kinds of positive results in some parts of Gauteng. But what is really worrying is that the capital, the national capital of the country in Tshwane, has some of the worst excesses when it comes to bad spending, consequence management failing, and the kind of chaos that we've seen. So here we're seeing on paper the consequence of people who are paid and elected to do jobs, not taking those jobs seriously and choosing partisan factional debates and battles over actually doing their jobs. And it has come time that political parties take seriously the fact that they have to deploy better people into these positions, and we may have to start thinking of a professional and a professionalized civil service that is operating outside of cadre deployment. The politics keeps coming up, and you'd think that political parties would learn their lessons, and that if you don't deliver, you're going to get voted out. And I just wonder what the political pressure is to keep deploying those people that are not capable. What is the overriding choice that they have to make between politics and service delivery?
I think that we often assume that there is a rational process happening inside political parties when it isn't always clear that it is that rational. The short-termism inside political parties in South Africa, demonstrated endlessly by the poor, sort of selection of leaders, the election of candidates with checkered records, and the protection of people who really ought not to be protected. And this often goes across party lines, is an indication that political parties often have very different agendas and aims from what governing would require of them. Because governing is a long-term process. It isn't just from one election to the next. It is in the interest of one's children and grandchildren. And I'm not certain that South Africa's political party members deployed into places in government have that longer-term vision. They seem to have a very short-term vision of either legacy building for something that they can show off at the end of 5 years or a year or 2 years, or they have self-enrichment in place. And the corruption of hiring consultants that don't do the job, not being able to check that those consultants are the appropriate people or that they've done the job appropriately, hiring people into civil service positions who are either indebted to you or too powerless to actually object. And we've had examples of really good civil servants, who've objected to the kinds of political machinations that officials might want to engage in. One thinks here, for example, of the treasurer in the scandal in Limpopo that involved an attempt to divert funding. We've seen whistleblowers acting up. We've seen, people simply standing up and saying, this will not be done. Let's not forget, in Johannesburg, in Gauteng, we had 2 civil servants standing up to the MEC who insisted that in the interest of her party's electoral performance, they must do a certain thing, the famous combi courts phenomenon. And they simply stood by it and said the Municipal Finance Management Act will not allow us to do this, and there are processes in place. And I think it is a massive misunderstanding of process and systems, which speaks to a massive illiteracy of the political governance system that we have in this country among so many people employed in and deployed to these municipalities. And that's a party blindness that I think is going to show up in the results in future, have already shown up in the results of 2021, and I think will start affecting 2024, particularly for the African National Congress, because the majority of the municipalities that have such poor records are in ANC-controlled areas and in ANC-governed provinces. And that I think ought to alarm people inside the ANC as much as it's alarmed the millions of people who live in these municipalities and deal daily with the consequences of sewage on their streets, poor supply of water, and all sorts of other really life-threatening issues that are the consequences of these poor choices and bad management.
All right, we've run out of time. Perhaps you could answer this final question briefly. The Auditor-General talked about the last administration left the state of affairs in a worse position than they found it. And then, we're waiting for the state capture final chapter this evening. And I just wonder if this culture starts from the top and then spreads down provincial to the municipalities.
Absolutely, and also from the bottom up, because it's at the municipal level that people experience the horror, and so the alarm should be ringing for the people currently elected into government that they must fix this, because they have one term. They cannot at the end of this term say, oh, it was people who did it in the 2016 to 2021 period. They will be judged in 2025 or 2026 on their record, and their judgments will begin to kick in the next year or so. So they have very little time to tighten their belts, tie their shoestrings, and get on with the job. We are out of time. South Africans are out of patience, and they need to do the job that they're paid to and elected to do.
Angelo, always good talking to you. Thank you so much. Your insights greatly appreciated as always.
Thank you.
All right, that's Angelo Fick, who's Director of Research at Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, talking to us about the Auditor-General's report, which paints a very dire picture of the state of our municipalities, sadly not new.